Hey everybody, welcome back to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week we are bringing you conversations about history and movies and history and everything else in between. And this week, we welcome back my friend, Drew McKevitt. You might know Drew. He came on to do Dirty Harry way back in the day, and he's come back on. His book just came out, Gun Country, Gun Capitalism, Culture and Control in Cold War America. Drew's one of my friends I've really developed through HATM. And we wanted to come on and do something else, and just Robocop. We're talking about this film from the 1980s that I think a lot of us grew up with, came out in 87. And I certainly have all these memories with it, but going back to watch it, I had all these new ways to engage with this, and this is the perfect reason why we have these kinds of movies on HATM. So Drew and I get into all of these different things, these ideas of policing, Detroit as this failed notion of America, what Robocop is. Is he the answer to Terminator? Is he the antithesis of Dirty Harry Callahan? What is Robocop? And why shouldn't more actors get PhDs in art history after all? So I hope you enjoy this podcast. This was a really awesome conversation. We just recorded it about 25 seconds ago. So dead or alive, you're coming with us. Sit back and relax, guys, because Robocop is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Drew McKevitt, what's going on, brother?
Hey, Jason. Thanks for having me again, man. I'm so happy to be. I am a repeat offender now. I'm on the list of repeat offenders.
I know, and you know what? I have your next movie picked out already. I'm sorry, but I have the Drew McKevitt trilogy in my head.
So we go Dirty Harry, Robocop, and
Black Rain.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, no doubt about it.
I want to go back. Well, actually, so I want the press to send me your other book for free. That's really,
we can arrange that. We can arrange that. That's fine. We got Michael Douglas and wait, who's the other guy? Andy Garcia in 1980s Kyoto. They're actually in Kyoto, right? Are they in? Yeah, Kyoto. I think maybe they're not in Tokyo.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember. I'd have to go back and watch it.
Ridley Scott directed that, I think.
Yeah, that is Ridley Scott. Yeah.
It is one of those movies that people sleep on, and low-key Andy Garcia, I don't know, like, he's great in some of this stuff as like the hothead young guy, that Untouchables, right? All this
who gets beheaded by motorcycle ninjas.
Thank you, man. Now people are like, you ruined.
That's kind of early in the film. That's not ruining anything.
It's one of the big things. It makes Michael Douglas go Michael Douglas-y on this. So,
I got so much to say about it. I mean, it's in my book. It's in the book. I wrote about Black Rain. So,
did you really?
Yeah. I got a whole chapter in that book on sort of U.S. films, representations of Japan in the 70s and 80s, including, it opens up with Shogun, which is now being re-released, been remade.
I have so many questions for you
by Hulu. Hulu or FX is putting out Shogun this month.
I want to watch it.
I know. I'm really excited about it. It's going to be great.
Are you really?
I loved the first one, the miniseries Shogun. It was fantastic. I mean, I love it in the sense that it was just hokey and over the top dramatic, but I mean, in terms of nostalgia, I love it.
Yeah. So I had people ask me, like, are you going to do the miniseries on it? I'm like, how much time do you guys think I have right now? I'm doing the HATM thing right now. We've got the Masters of the Air, which is currently on right now. We're going to do the Franklin miniseries. I'm like, I don't know that many people, and also I need to sleep at some point in time. But it does look.
Hey, look, you got a lot of friends on Twitter who will get on the internets here and help you out with these films. Yeah,
true that. Actually, we're also going to do Do you remember the John Adams miniseries?
Oh yeah, the HBO one. Sure, that was good. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a prominent scholar who's been on this podcast more than once, joining the Drew McKevitt fan club, who is going to be coming on to do that one. We're going to go back and revisit that one right before her book, Lindsay Chervinsky, comes out. So
nice. That'll be a great one. I love that miniseries. That was great.
Dude, I actually named my kid Benjamin Franklin not Franklin, but Benjamin Herbert, because I was all hopped up after watching this. So I was like, yeah, Franklin.
I thought you were going to say you named your kid Paul Giamatti. Paul Giamatti Herbert.
I named him Pig Vomit Herbert.
Pig vomit.
Yeah. So, all right. So this is your second time back. Welcome back. You want to introduce yourself to the crowd for people who did not listen to the Opus? That was the Dirty Harry Pod.
The Opus. So I'm Drew McKevitt, otherwise professionally go by Andrew C. McKevitt. I am a history professor at Louisiana Tech University in Ruston, Louisiana, although I live here in Shreveport, Louisiana.
All right. So I have to tell you, I guess as all time, as people are like coming to the pod and they're like, hey, what's an episode I should listen to? You know, got a couple three, and that one we did on Dirty Harry is actually still one of my like absolute favorite ones we've ever done. It was the first time you and I ever had a conversation. We had a blast. We like dug into it, and also you failed the homework famously on that because you were like, "Oh, I thought I was supposed to pick a movie I hate," and then we.
Well, here we are now. I didn't even pick this movie, and I love this movie. I love Robocop. I think it's brilliant.
Well, this came up right because you ended up. You're telling me you were. Robocop was in your dissertation, but didn't make it into the book, was it, or something along that? What happened?
Yeah, so as we could talk about, I became interested in. So the book is it's called "Consuming Japan: Popular Culture in the Globalizing of 1980s America." This is my first book. It came out 7 years ago now with University of North Carolina Press. And it's a book about the relationship between the United States and Japan in the 1970s and the 1980s. But rather than write from a kind of traditional diplomatic history perspective, I wrote about that relationship primarily through Americans consuming Japanese things. So I wrote about automobiles and sushi and electronics and anime, Japanese animation. But I also have a chapter in there on representations of Japan in American film, including Black Rain, including Shogun, including other classics like what else is in there? The Yakuza, which is a 1975 film. The Bad News Bears do they go to Tokyo or Japan? Is it Bad News Bears go to Tokyo? Whichever.
I can't. I think it's Japan.
The ones that the one where they go to Tokyo, and Rising Sun as well. So I was interested in these.
Wait, the Sean Connery film?
The Sean Connery film, yeah, with Wesley Snipes, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could do that one too. We could do a back-to-back Black Rain, and
are we gonna do a series of fives? Or are we gonna do like are we gonna do the John Wick?
A pentology. That's right.
A pentology, a pentagram, the HAT pentagram.
We could do a whole like mini trilogy on the U.S. Japan stuff. So anyway, I was interested in a lot of those films. Got me thinking about the representation of Japanese capitalism in the United States in the 1970s and the 1980s, and thinking more generally about how capitalism was represented on film, American film, in the 1980s. And, thinking about one of the things that pops up all the time when you think about U.S.-Japan relations in the 70s and 80s is the U.S. auto industry and Detroit specifically. So I was interested in these film representations of Detroit. And of course, none, I think, is more prominent than Robocop himself or itself. And there's also, you talked about Action Jackson, right? I think a couple weeks ago because of Carl Weathers, right?
Well, yeah, we did with Carl Weathers, right? We did on the Sunday night thing, right? Yeah.
Another
we did a pod, yeah.
Yeah, another film about Detroit, right? Carl Weathers is, what's his name? Jericho Action Jackson.
Yeah,
that's right. And he is that's in Detroit. Detroit's a real kind of gritty place. It's represented as kind of post-industrial. The signaling there is that Detroit means like American decline. It means danger. It means crime. It means gang problems, things like that. And there's other films. Another one that really stood out to me was Beverly Hills Cop. So Axel Foley,
that on HATM the week before.
Perfect, right? So Axel Foley, he's a Detroit cop, and the beginning of that film, Detroit is gritty, it's tough. His friend is killed right in front of him, right, shot to death right in front of him. And then where does he go? He goes to California, where it's sunny, it's bright, it's shining, and so to me, it was like this sort of representation of like the first half of American industrial 20th century capitalism, and then sort of, the latter third of American capitalism in the 20th century, turning its eye towards California, which is also turning its eye towards Asia, which is turning its eye towards Japan and so forth. So I was really interested in these film representations of Detroit. And I don't know, there was just no place for it in the dissertation, which eventually became the book. So I've always had Robocop in the back of my mind here. Thinking about what it has to tell us about the United States in the 1980s, about American capitalism, about American policing, and so forth. So perfect subject for this podcast.
Yeah, and this actually ties together. You talk about this now; it really ties together your first two books, and I'm hoping your third book will also tie into RoboCop, which will be about. I don't even know how you're going to do that at some point.
I'm open to suggestions. Whatever you got, I'm open to suggestions.
Write the history of Detroit from Louisiana. Just
that. Well, there's already a lot of great historians of Detroit. I don't want to step on their toes.
What? I don't know
sure.
Who?
Oh, Heather Thompson. Heather Thompson's written about Detroit. I mean, that's
yeah, she's my friend, but
she's
shit. Now you've completely in like 2 seconds you've dismantled
my. There's a lot of great stuff in Detroit. Yeah.
That's really shit all over like
Tom Shagru. Tom Shagru is a great.
Fine, there are other talented people writing about the great state of Michigan.
I mean, these are classic books in the canon of American 20th century post-war history.
Well, can I tell you? So it's so funny. Before we jump into RoboCop, the thing I got into last year was actually immigration history. And just, I do, my own work is really kind of environmental, set in Florida, the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's fun just to read other scholars doing other things to kind of see how the wheels are spinning. I think in a lot of ways, it's really helpful for me as a scholar of indigenous Florida during that time period to read like well beyond, to see how people are going to the archives, how they're thinking, how they write and things like that. And I've always been fascinated with post-war Los Angeles. This has always been a thing for me. And I started reading, and it really actually started by when I read Sarah McNamara's book, but then she turned me on to Natalia Molina's book, which was this really terrific book about a restaurant in Los Angeles in the 1950s and 60s. And then I was talking to a couple other people like, oh, you got to read this other book, like Emerald City or something like that. It's just I dig it. I really am enjoying reading these city histories. They're so rich and there's so much going on there. It's, it's fun.
Yeah, I have a real romance for that kind of post-war California history, right? Because it's like and in part because it's shaped by Hollywood itself, right? Which is always presenting like suburban California as some sort of American norm. And so you grow up watching films in the United States in the 80s and 90s, and that suburban California experience is extrapolated to be a kind of universal American experience. And so I have that same sort of romance, I think, for post-war California history.
Well, I just sent you right before you came on, like logo redesigns of the HATM logo that I'm looking at. And it's so funny because the last time I was at Walt Disney World with my girlfriend, we were at Hollywood Studios. And if you go down there, you take a right on Sunset Strip, you have the music and the golden age of Hollywood with that look. But they've got like the fruit stands and things like that. And I'm thinking about like migrant labor and all this kind of stuff and citrus. And I'm like, oh, I'm ruining this again. But it's so fascinating. So if you're out there listening, I'm dying. Like I'm actually recording on Gidget on Tuesday to talk about Los Angeles beach culture and things like that. The rise of surfing and things like that and how that changes. So yeah, totally right there with you. So all right, let's talk about not Los Angeles. Let's talk about the alt Los Angeles. Let's talk about Detroit.
The anti-Los Angeles, sure.
Yeah, exactly. We both watched this, I'm assuming, growing up in the 80s.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. I mean, I was actually thinking about this, right? So, like, what do I remember about this film? So it's 1987. I was 7 years old when this came out.
I was 10.
I definitely watched it at some point, which makes me question all kinds of rules my parents, right? Because there is nothing appropriate about this for a 7-year-old to be watching. What I remember is I remember the blood and the gore and the violence, right? I mean, which is meant to, it's shocking because it's meant to be shocking. And you watch it today and it's like, the scene where Alex Murphy, right? Peter Weller has his hand blown off by Clarence Boddicker, I think that's his name. Kurtwood Smith, who's just far and away like blows everyone away in this film in terms of the acting.
He's so good.
He is so good. He is so good to watch. I mean, you could have 2 hours of just him kind of talking and bullying his gang around and it would be eminently watchable. But I remember that, and you watch it today and it's like, it's so obviously silly in part because we're watching on like better definition television screens, right? I watched this on HBO. It's sending the signal in HD, and this is a film made in 1987, and you can see the very plastic hand that Peter Weller's holding, and it sort of explodes. But 7-year-old me was like, both horrified and kind of fascinated by that. And it's just incredible to me that this was a movie, I think, kind of marketed to children. Of course, it's rated R. I don't know how many children went to see it in theaters. I don't know when it was that I saw it, but like there were and just to like make sure I wasn't imagining this stuff, I was Googling this. There were action figures of all kinds for this, right? I mean, intending to be sold to like young children like me. Robocop ended up in that 80s action hero pantheon alongside like Rambo and every Schwarzenegger character. And that's how he's marketed, which is kind of incredible to me. Now, like what you don't get when you're a 7-year-old or when you're a 10-year-old, unless you were a very precocious 10-year-old and were thinking critically about texts when you were way back in 1987. And I think we'll spend a good amount of time talking about is the really just sharp critique of contemporary America and capitalism that this movie puts forward. And I don't think that's just me, stereotypical Marxist professor, saying that. It's hard, I think, to be a thinking person in any way and not see that criticism here, for better or worse. It really sort of smashes you over the head. And in that way, maybe we can talk a little more about Dirty Harry later. But I think in that way, it's a much better film than Dirty Harry. And in some ways, it's the anti-Dirty Harry. It's sort of a critique of what Dirty Harry put forward, some 15 years before.
Yeah, this is for a movie about a guy with a huge gun, and the gun we'll talk about the gun here in a minute. This is a very loaded film, and you're absolutely right. Watching this was a different film than I remember. I remember in the 80s, so we probably saw it in 88 when it was coming back out on HBO for the first time, right? Or we're putting in the VHS and just watching that, right? We weren't going to theater, but at the same time, this film felt like it was marketed towards us. And I felt in some ways, Drew, there's obviously a very real connection because you even see this now in video games where he shows back up in like Mortal Kombat and things like that. I actually saw a clip of like Robocop fighting Terminator in Mortal Kombat recently, and I thought, wow, it's really fascinating because he's really the alt Terminator in this show in a lot of ways too, right? This is before we have the face turn of Arnold in 91. So right, we've Terminator only known the Terminator as a villain, and he's like, okay, here's this big metallic thing. So, and yeah, there's absolutely so many different things we can talk about. A couple things I want to run by you here. 80s flashbacks. When I watch these films, it's so much more. If you did not grow up under the Cold War, boy, did we ever take this stuff for granted.
That's right.
And of course today, and yesterday I'm reading about now Russia has spy satellites that can EMP. It's like, what the hell? This is great for the pod, I guess, but I'm seeing apartheid South Africa, which never fails to weird me out every time I see this, right? And Star Wars. And of course, by this, we're talking about the Reagan era laser stuff that was supposed to...
The laser stuff. Not to be confused with TJ Laser, the star of the TV show that Alex Murphy's son is obsessed with in the film, right? Yeah, so we've got, it's... I
kept thinking about Laser Cats from Saturday Night Live. When he said TJ Laser.
TJ Laser. It's like an 80s flashback, but it's also, it's kind of an 80s. Well, it's a sort of weird flash forward because like we don't know what the year is in the film, right? That's one sort of interesting thing. It doesn't say like 1995 or 2000, and everyone is mostly dressed like in contemporary fashion. It's not like a Star Wars or even Star Trek kind of thing where they're trying to like imagine what people are dressed like in the future. And the cars all look the same, right? Like the police cars, right? The police cars they're driving are like, Mercuries or Crown Vics or that sort of thing. So it's not intended to be like science fiction like 100 years in the future, maybe like 5 or 10 years in the future, something like that. And, for all the ways that the film is like prescient, it's pointing to these international issues, like right from the start, right? Because we get all these news flashes right at the beginning that that really put you in context, in part because they don't remain they're not all that long lasting, right? So it's 1987. We still have apartheid South Africa. This is a country still ruled by a white supremacist government, an explicitly white supremacist government. But they're imagining in the film, they're imagining some sort of future in which the white ruling minority and the repressed black majority come into some violent conflict, that the ruling white government has armed itself with a neutron bomb to prevent the fall of, I think they say Pretoria, sort of the capital of white South Africa, right? And so to put this in some context from the perspective of 1987, what was fascinating to me is if you thought about democracy coming to places like South Africa or Eastern Europe, where communism still held control in 1987, and nobody in 1987 is looking at Eastern Europe and saying communism is going to be gone in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Most people would have imagined those things ending through some pretty serious violence. And, as the historian, like, what's amazing about the wave of democratization that washes over much of the world in the late 80s and the early 90s is just how peaceful so much of it was. Of course, there were plenty of places where it was not peaceful or even successful, right? If you think about China in 1989 or Southeastern Europe, the Balkans in the early 1990s. But certainly it wasn't unusual to expect an even greater conflagration in 1987, right? If you imagine, like, what are those places going to look like when they fall apart? And so I think that South Africa bit is imagining like a world of chaos as the world moves toward democratization. And then, of course, there's Reagan's Star Wars. This is the the pew pew, the lasers. This is the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, sometimes or more formally referred to as SDI. Ronald Reagan didn't name it Star Wars. That was his media critics who dubbed it Star Wars when he announced it in 1984, in part because it sounded like science fiction. The idea that the United States could build a series or a system of lasers and mirrors in space, like all of this is just mostly coming out of like Reagan's brain in 1984. This system that could shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles that the Soviets or anyone else might fire at the United States. It was science fiction in 1984, and in some ways remains science fiction today. But the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, these really essentially make the point kind of moot. There's no longer any concern that anyone had the ICBMs ready to fire at us. So, like that opening there, I think, as we'll talk about, I think the film is very prescient in a number of ways, but maybe not so much in these kind of contextual ways, which might be harder for younger viewers today. Although, I should bring up, like we've just heard, I heard on the news this morning, there are very few details about a Russian anti-satellite system that either the State Department or the Defense Department today had to kind of confirm because some congressman had like leaked word of this in a hearing or something to that effect. And also, I don't know if you noticed, but one of the news segments later in the film talks about U.S. troops at war in Mexico, in Acapulco, right? One of the ones about somebody says, oh, we were supposed to go there last week. And it's like Mexican, I don't know if they were insurgents or whoever had seized control of it. And here we are this week hearing about Trump's plans to essentially invade Mexico in a second term or something to that effect. So in some ways prescient, in other ways maybe not so much.
It's so weird because you have these relationships, and this is the reason why I like to really choose these films that we have real personal relationships to, because when I watch these films, I go back in time to thinking about, as a 10-year-old kid, the world still feels safe to me. Although everything built around me tells me we're very much thinking we're about to go to World War III. All the way from the shows that we're watching, the toys that we're playing with, the G.I. Joe, Cobra obviously being a stand-in for communism and all these different stuff and things like that. And everything around us tells us, hey, this is going to end, and it's going to end really badly.
Yeah, I don't want to call out the political scientists here because they have a lovely discipline. But the political scientists went through a great crisis in 1991 after the collapse of communism, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They kind of latched onto this like Cold War nostalgia because in a way, like, you knew who the enemy was. and you knew what the enemy was capable of. And by 1989, you'd been talking to the enemy in pretty close contact, at least since the early 1970s. But in some ways, going much further back than that, we're talking about an enemy that was at one time a great ally of the United States during the Second World War. And when that falls apart, all of those certainties go with it. Right? A bipolar world was easy for the political scientists to measure. It was comfortable for them to measure in the 1980s. And in some ways, it's why they didn't see the end coming, right? And so what comes after that? There's a lot of uncertainty. So, maybe this is I don't know if it's an allegory or a metaphor for our own youths of innocence and certainty and emerging into the 1990s into, I don't know, uncertainty and a new world, certainly in the aftermath of 9/11, a world that nobody had anticipated. If maybe they should have, but certainly nobody did.
Yeah, Drew, I kind of wonder for world scholars who were talking about this, or the political scientists, things like that. One thing that fascinates me is, geopolitically, the United States has always operated with an us versus them kind of thing, and then putting a very real face on quote unquote the enemy or things like that. And then Gorbachev becomes a teddy bear. He like after the Soviet Union falls, he's over here in the U.S. There are Gorby dolls. It's hard to explain. The
Pizza Hut commercials.
The Pizza Hut commercials. Oh my gosh! I hope we can cut that into this pod because they are fascinating. It is, and I'm sure people are writing about this. If people are listening and have some thoughts on works, we should know about that. This absolutely blows my mind because I remember growing up like, yeah, he's Russian, but he's our Russian. It's hard to explain, boy.
If only we had a Gorbachev today.
Well, so going back to Russia, right, which has these interesting things that happen. So in the 1990s, shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, we get involved in Persian Gulf War, and now all of a sudden, I remember Hank Williams Jr. refraining in a pre-Toby Keith-esque line, "When the eagle and the bear make a mighty strong pair." I'm like, wait,
wow,
the Russians are good now?
That's a deep cut there.
Oh, isn't it though? If we could put shall we make the listeners listen to Hank Jr.? I think it's fine. And now we've got Putin back in charge, who is very much a Cold Warrior, very much trying to resurrect, and I think in a lot of ways, villainizing the United States or antagonizing the United States gives him power and gives, frankly, a failing nation something to rally against. I think that the Cold War, resurrecting the Cold War, is good for Russia in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think potentially there's some truth to that, right? There's a lot. You could ask a lot of questions about the motivations of somebody like Putin. Is he trying to resurrect the Cold War? Is he trying to resurrect some older Russian nationalism? Some Russian imperial nationalism of the pre-1917 era, right? Making claims to the Black Sea and that sort of thing, which go all the way back to at least the 18th century, if not further. But I don't know. We've got better things to talk about than that.
Famed
bastard.
Russian scholar Jason Herbert with his ideas here. All right, let's go back to Detroit. You keyed on this. This is not an accident, like you said earlier, that this film is set in Detroit. And so many films, like you said, that it's like Detroit becomes the stand-in for American Decay, the falling America. I mean,
yeah, I think that's fair. Detroit is meant to signal a really bad place, like what's gone wrong with post-war America, my kind of most dangerous place in the United States, a kind of murder capital, a crime capital, that sort of thing. And it's one of the, it's perhaps maybe the most iconic of American cities that is devastated by the flight of capital in the post-war era, right? So it's obviously it's where the auto industry becomes a global giant. It becomes the arsenal of democracy during the Second World War, but capital starts to flee as early as the 1950s, and so money starts leaving the city. White Detroiters start moving to the suburbs, following those jobs because they have the resources to do so, and it leaves behind the inner core of Detroit suffering from what eventually we'll come to call, we use the word deindustrialization. And the populations it leaves behind, mostly Black Detroiters, they're at a loss for jobs, education, social services. 1967 is really kind of the key year in post-war Detroit history because there's a violent uprising sparked by an instance of police brutality that turns into days of rage. More than 40 people are killed. Most of them are killed by police and National Guard, who are kind of firing wildly into crowds and into buildings. And they're called in essentially to restore order. There are even regular army units that had spent time in Vietnam are called into Detroit in 1967 to help restore order. But in essence, it's not so much the regular army units as it is the police and the National Guard who end up killing a lot of people in Detroit. So by choosing Detroit, it's meant to signal an urban American environment dealing with the worst of the post-war American urban crisis, the crime, the drugs, the poverty, the lack of jobs, that sort of thing. And in the film, they call this out in the film. They specifically refer to Old Detroit, right? We're not sure exactly when this is taking place, but presumably at some point in the near future. And all of those hopes of like the early 20th century have just crumbled in what's represented as this violent, dangerous place. It's run by these criminal overlords, Clarence Boddicker, Kurt Smith's character. The head of the OCP, right? So we're talking about this main entity here is Omni Consumer Products, just as like vaguely just the perfect name for what this thing is, the Omni Consumer Products, which is running the Detroit Police Department here. We talk about the privatization of police forces and other things. He says his line is, "Old Detroit has a cancer, and that cancer is crime, and the cancer must be cut out." And so the plan for OCP, this big kind of mega corporation with its hands in all different aspects of American society, is they're going to build what they call Delta City atop basically the ruins of Old Detroit. There's still people living in Old Detroit, but they're going to build it right on top of Old Detroit. The plan is just an astronomical number. They're going to bring in 2 million workers to build this new urban paradise of Delta City. And as we find out later, the OCP has some dealings with local organized criminal elements to exploit that workforce. And as you said, this isn't unique to films from the era. We got Action Jackson, we got Beverly Hills Cop, in which Detroit is portrayed as the past and California maybe sort of the future. If you think about it, in Beverly Hills Cop, Detroit is like the Henry Ford to Steve Jobs or something like that. So Detroit's an important character here, I think, and it's meant to signal something to viewers in the 1980s who would pick up on it, I think, more so than somebody watching it, 35 years later might.
Yeah, I'm thinking about this. I'm also thinking about 8 Mile, where the city is portrayed in a very, impoverished situation. And I'm kind of wondering if there are films in which Detroit is portrayed as a vibrant city, as a city with a hope or a future. I've got to imagine maybe there is, but nothing's coming to mind, man.
Nothing's coming to mind. It's got to be something out there. I mean, if anything, just to sort of counter this common representation. I'm sure some listener is gonna message you and say, "Hey, man, you forgot about."
Well, Chrysler had a really cool ad campaign several years back where they were calling their stuff imported from Detroit.
Right.
And I was like, that's cool.
The irony was actually that it was imported from Canada, where a lot of Chrysler, I mean, they've gotten better over the last decade or so, but they were one of the earliest and very worst offenders at using imported parts and even imported assembled vehicles. In the United States. I mean, they're one of the reasons why the UAW, why Detroit got crushed so much in the early 1980s is because they were just moving production overseas. It was so much cheaper. It was not unionized labor. They didn't have to deal with those workforces that had pensions and everything else. And so there was a kind of irony to the imported from Detroit campaign because nobody was worse than Chrysler when it came to that sort of thing. Although I think they've reinvested at least in Michigan more generally.
Well, if they'd like to sponsor the podcast, we can edit out the last 45 seconds. That's right. Fine. They can rebuild America right
Look,
here.
I don't have any morals or principles here. Whatever we need to do to make some money, that's what we're going to do.
That's why we got into history, Drew. It's for the bucks. Right. As I've watched films and started to understand like the ways in which people are portrayed in the United States, I'm thinking about The Wire. I'm thinking about New Orleans, with Treme, which I really enjoyed. I think of Detroit as a black city, and I don't really see a lot of representation here in this film. Did you? I was kind of looking to see, okay, where are African Americans portrayed in this film? I felt like this was one of the misses on this. Am I wrong here?
No, it's not great. It's not great. They did not do a very good job with this. Today I think Detroit has maybe like 75% black population. I think that's probably a conservative estimate. And what do we have in the film? We have one bad guy and one corporate guy, right? So there's the bad guy who has just the most annoying laugh possible. It's like he's like trying to laugh like a hyena every time, like the bad guys do. Yeah. The guy, right? The pissing guy. Which too, right? We're bringing in notions there of like black sexuality, right? Because he's exposed, and what's her name? Lewis, the Robocop's partner, comes up and he's like, what does he say? Like, you want me to put this away first, right? So it's like the white woman observing a black man, right? And not great there in terms of representation. And there is the one other. There's the corporate guy, one of the sort of cronies of what the hell's his name? One of the
Miguel Ferrer.
Yeah, that's right.
Miguel Ferrer is George Clooney's cousin. That guy's
I had no idea. He died a few years ago too. He kind of died prematurely.
I always liked him. Did you see him in was it Traffic?
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. I haven't watched Traffic in, I don't know, 10, 15. 15 years.
Yeah. Clooney's cousin. I think he's from Cincinnati.
I had no idea. I don't know. I had no idea. So he
it's Rosemary Clooney's son.
Oh, okay. Wait, no, George Clooney is Rosemary Clooney's son.
No, he is her nephew.
Oh wait, he's her nephew. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know.
There's also the desk sergeant.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So, that was the other thing I was going to say is the other, we have a cohort of black actors who are playing cops, right? Which I think is a little more, I don't know. I didn't count it up, right? But one thing worth noting, I looked this up. I found this piece of data in a newspaper article from 1987. Look at the extensive research I have done to prepare for your podcast, Jason.
You sounded a bit like Casey Kasem right there. Go on.
The Detroit Police Department in 1987 was almost 50% black officers. And that made it one of the best ratios of its kind in the country, meaning it kind of closely approximated the percentage of Detroit's black population more generally, and also most certainly a product of that post-1967 moment where one of the criticisms of the black community of the Detroit Police Department and its regular practices of abuse and brutality was that these are white officers who are abusing the black residents of Detroit. And so better representation within the police department might address that. I think scholars who study policing would say that actually doesn't end up happening. But the Detroit Police Department was almost 50% black in 1987. And today it's something like 2/3 of the Detroit Police Department is black. So it's closer to a reflection of the population more generally. I don't know. But more generally, I don't know if I'd want to defend the decision, but given that so many of the characters in the film are criminals, perhaps the decision was to choose not to reproduce representations of black criminality, given that Americans saw plenty of them to begin with. So you didn't, decisions not to use more black actors among, the gang, for instance, right? There's one black actor in there. Maybe, maybe it was a decision not to reproduce those kinds of images. But otherwise not great choices here in terms of representation. And that's more problematic of Hollywood generally in the 1980s, right? We have very few black actors given prominent roles throughout the decade. There's Eddie Murphy, there's our friend Carl Weathers, Danny Glover. But otherwise, really, it's not until the 90s when we get the era of black leading men like Denzel Washington, Wesley Snipes, and so forth.
Yeah, we talked about this when we did the Carl Weathers pod. It's when you look at the return on investment that Action Jackson got. Incredibly successful film. He's a little bit older. I think I think Carl Weathers like 44 when they're filming this film, releasing this film.
How old I am. I'm in my Action Jackson moment. This is it.
Thank you to Liam Neeson, who completely changed what we think of as an action star, really, as far as expanding.
Right. I got decades to go where I can,
There's no world in which Action Jackson doesn't have a trilogy made in in the 2020s at this point
Yeah.
in time.
Oh yeah.
And
yeah.
I don't know if that speaks to whether or not American audiences, because the United States, because Hollywood was really was less globally inclined in the 1980s, pitching almost solely to American audiences whether or not they were really going to accept a black man as lead in the 19. Because Carl Weathers, we said this the other night, was like he walked so Wesley Snipes could fly. It was really what was going on. Yeah, and now I don't know. So there is a phrase that is etched in my head now for the last 36 years of my life.
I'm gonna say, can I guess it?
Go for it.
I'd buy that for $1.
I can hear it right now when you say it. Also, I heard it's so the guy is so gross. The scenes, You talked about the critique of corporate America, of commercialization. This is clearly what's going on here. Can we talk? I wish I could take that out of my head. I can hear it just as clear as anything. Can we talk a little bit about that?
It took me a long time because I think, I don't know, everyone of our generation knows that phrase. Like, I'd buy that for $1, but I don't remember this coming from Robocop. So it's a phrase that's been in my head for 30 some odd years too. And I Googled it. I'm like, where did that come from? Where did they take that from? It's from the film. It has only ever been in the film. I mean, that's where it came from originally. I thought they were mocking some kind of older, because in my mind, like nostalgia brain or whatever, like thinking back 40, 50 years, like there must have been some game show or something in the 60s or 70s that this came from. And it's like, no, this is where it came from. And I was sort of surprised to discover that all these years later. And I think that, that phrase that's the phrase of the film, right? And it's because of how prescient the film is in terms of, to use a very loaded word, the rise of neoliberalism, right? This is a very disputed and kind of umbrella term describing the privatization of public goods, whether those be education, healthcare, police, and other emergency services, prisons, and even amazingly here, they talk about it in one of the OCP meetings, space exploration, right? Which, as far as I know, in 1987 was still very much the stuff of science fiction, not space exploration, but private corporations doing space exploration. And now we've got, Musk and Bezos and everyone else with their own sort of personal penis rocket ship. So we have OCP, Omni Consumer Products, just the fact that you have a consumer products company running a police department. The idea here is that everything is for sale. And they boast about in that board meeting, they're boasting about moving into all these other spheres of social life that we often think of as nonprofit spaces. In fact, that number 2 guy, right? Dick Jones, that's his name, the number 2 guy at OCP. He even says this: we're moving into fields that were traditionally thought of as nonprofit, and we're going to figure out a way to make a profit off of hospitals, off of police, off of prisons, off of space. The way they talk about Robocop too, right? There's the line that, God, I keep forgetting his name, Miguel Ferrer, right? He says, he doesn't have a name. He has a program. He's a product, right? When they're thinking about who Robocop is, he's just a product to sell. He's not a human being. There is just an extensive critique of dumb consumer society all over here, right? Everything's for sale. What's the first commercial you see at the beginning? They're pitching a commercial for like robotic hearts. You could have a heart transplant and you could pick whatever kind of heart you want, right? He says, like, you want the athletic heart? We got the athletic heart. There's that one game where they're playing like a board game, and basically the game is like to destroy your opponent through nuclear war.
Yeah, it's like Battleship with nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's right. So everything is for sale. And then we have our friend, gosh, I don't even know what his name is. I'm not sure they say Bixby, right? They say his name is Bixby, this character in this TV show everybody's watching. You learn almost nothing about this TV show. This is so great one of the great things about the film is all this world building, right? Is that like there's this TV show and everybody's watching it and everybody knows it. And you as the viewer, you don't know anything about it. But you can see that they're enjoying it and they're laughing at it. And it's very, very stupid and simplistic. It's just this old kind of creepy man creeping on like these younger, attractive women. And then every time, his catch line is, I'd buy that for $1. I don't know. In some ways, the character's kind of Trumpian in a way. But, in some ways,
it was weird, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Just like gross. I mean, it reminds you of like Donald Trump at like a, I don't know, beauty pageant or something like that. And it's, the other thing is it's idiocracy, right? It's
So much
idiocracy,
so.
but packaged in like an 80s action film. And as one of the criminals kind of astutely says when they're like hauling boxes of drugs around or whatever, talking about the drug trade, and he says, "There's no better way to steal money than free enterprise." And I think that is the heart of the film here too. Also, notice the way they talk about unions and how the company OCP treats the union, the police. I don't know if they're in a union or they're unionizing, but they threaten a strike, right? And this is kind of common neoliberal thinking today. That unions are trouble. They're kind of perverse actors who distort the mechanisms of the market. You don't negotiate with them. You undermine them. And that's OCP's tactic. These are workers in Detroit, of all places, right? Where unions built an industrial empire, and then they watched that empire kind of crumble in their hands in the 70s and 80s. The police sergeant, he walks in at the beginning, right, when the one cop says, "We should strike," and he walks in and he says, "We're not plumbers, we're police officers, and police officers don't strike." And so he's got this older conception of cops as public servants that just don't match this new world of privatization, in which they're not really public servants; they're corporate employees, just like factory workers or truck drivers or whatever. And I don't want to go too far with this. Maybe this is a little too much sort of amateur psycho history here. But I think, Alex Murphy's predicament, Robocop's predicament, essentially being murdered by these sadistic criminals and then revived to become a tool of a capitalist corporation. They say that line in there. Where is it? He signed a release when he joined the force. He's legally dead. We can do what we want with him. This speaks to a kind of anxiety about death in this techno-capitalist dystopia that, we could all end up as some failed experiment on Elon Musk's resume. We're now implanting chips in people's brains, right? Apparently his company has done that for the first time. And undoubtedly there are these tech bros out there who are working on some vision of immortality, keeping the brain alive while the body dies. And to what end, right? Elon and his weird, creepy techno-fascist pals, they're going to be okay. They'll be content. But what do we do with the workers' brains when their bodies die? That's a bleak vision of the future. But that's, I mean, again, I think another way in which this film is quite prescient.
Did you catch the part about the elected official holding everyone at gunpoint while he demands a recount?
That's right. Again, I don't want to say there's anything prescient going on here. There's no allegory or metaphor here for what's going on. And he's so corruptible too, right? Like they try to talk him. He's so easily corruptible. It's like, we'll give you the fancy brand new car, right? This car they keep referring to, which is just perfectly named, right? The sucks. The 6000 sucks. The 6000 SUX. So like on the one hand, like, he, again, like perfect for 2024 or 2020, 2021. Like he's on the one hand, like pretending to be standing up for some sense of justice about how democracy works or whatever. He wants a recount because that's, he's claiming corruption or whatever. But on the other hand, he's so susceptible to being bribed. And essentially, Robocop comes in to administer justice. And this gets at the sort of complicated line here of what it means to administer justice, right? Robocop comes in and he just beats the shit out of people, or he kills people eventually later in the film. And that, as viewers, we're meant to question, is that a kind of justice, or is something else going on here?
Yeah, I want to get into Robocop and as a character here in 1 second, but I have one last question for you before we do so. Is this the first time you've ever seen a compact disc on screen? This is 1987.
Yeah, I don't remember. No, there's got to be something before this, because I think CD players come out in 85 commercially. I want to say they're commercially available in 1985. So
are they? I don't know.
I think so. As someone who pretended to write about consumer electronics in the 1980s, I think 85 is kind of the target date for for the compact disc.
Did you ever see the Dolph Lundgren epic "I Come in Peace"?
Wait, that's a film?
Oh yeah, you didn't.
Oh, I don't remember that.
There's an alien.
I need to Google
space
this.
Guy who comes down while you're doing this. Who comes down to Earth trying to extract like endorphins out of people's brains because that's a drug on his world.
Wait.
Secret weapon.
Oh, okay. Here it is.
Serious.
Yeah.
His secret weapon is he shoots CDs at people, and they. Also, I know you're a sports fan. Our first on-screen appearance of Jay Billis of ESPN basketball fame as a intergalactic bounty hunter who, spoiler alert, dies trying to kill this guy early on. So it takes grizzled detective Dolph Lundgren
in this film. In this film, Jay Billis.
Yeah.
What? That is the
Jay
most
Billis
random. It's like you just made that, like an AI just made that up. That sounds like an AI hallucination.
Congratulations! We just found the fifth film of your.
I guess so. We've got. Well, in that case, I got to go watch this Dolph Lundgren classic.
You know what? We've got to do that on the pod. We seriously have to do "I Come in Peace" like this.
I just googled it, and it is it is known also by another name, which is Dark Angel. It's also known as Dark Angel, an alternative title, I guess, because "I Come in Peace" is a little sort of weird.
It's got one of the great. It's got, what year does that come out?
1990.
94?
1990.
Okay.
Oh, it's early.
We watched this on tape, and it's got one of the great inlines. I can't ruin that part for you. It's my gift to you. Sit down.
All right. I'm putting it on the list. You can watch it now for free on Tubi.
Are you serious?
Also on the Roku channel. Yeah, it's available.
Oh, okay.
What, you think somebody's holding on to the rights to these films? Like, one day I'm going to make it big with...
I know somebody who's about to be buying the rights
Dolph
over here.
Lundgren, 1990
Empire.
classic.
It's gonna be our first. It's gonna be our first reproduction. In fact, I'll be the intergalactic guy. All right. Let's talk about Robocop himself, because this is. We can go to 1,000 different places, Drew. As you know, I've got your book here. You and I talked about this as this was being developed. I closely followed when you would tweet about this. I was so excited it was going to come out, and it's. Coming out to great acclaim. I'm so happy, and just thrilled for the way people have fallen for this book. Let's talk about Robocop himself, and let's talk about the gun.
Oh, you don't even want to talk about Alex Murphy. You just want to fetishize the firearms.
You know what?
Let's talk about the gun.
Anti-Irish bias here on HATM, and my ancestors' English. It's whatever. It's fine. All right, fine. Let's go into Peter Weller's Alex Murphy.
Let's talk about the gun. The most important thing you need to know about this Robocop gun is you can buy one today. I looked this up. So really, it's just a 9mm. It's just a 9mm Beretta that you can. It's got some sort of machined parts added on, and it looks ridiculous. But there is a company today that reproduces this gun and will sell it to you. Presumably, they'll ship it to some local dealer, and you can buy it from them. And it comes with a custom OCP case, and there's a manual. They say there's a manual that's an OCP manual, so you can buy this gun. Yeah, the gun is kind of remarkable. I mean, the best shot you get of the gun is when Robocop's taking off his helmet and he's hanging out with Lewis there, and Lewis grabs the gun, and you can see how big it is, right? Because it's hard to tell, but she doesn't strike me as a very big person. But you can see this gun is like
5'2", 5'3".
I mean, it's almost like she's holding a rifle, and she gives it to Robocop, right? And it's an automatic, as best we could tell, it's an automatic 9mm, right? So a handgun that is essentially a machine gun, which is just incredibly rare because. You think about the mechanics of a machine gun, right? Like, you need, one of the fundamentals of a machine gun is you need somewhere for all that force to go, and it's got to go into your shoulder. So, to be able to fire an automatic handgun, you got to have hand strength equivalent to like a big, strong shoulder and that sort of thing. So, he's firing it at the range at the beginning, and somebody's like, "Look at that fucking gun," right? Like, they're just all fascinated by this thing and how powerful it is. And, I think maybe sort of gets to that, this kind of arms race that the law enforcement are having with criminals in the 1980s and the 1990s, a justification for loading up on more and more military style weapons. And it is just a fascinating thing that you too can buy. I didn't look into the price. They weren't really like advertising the price there, so it must be a rather expensive thing. But you can buy a fully operational. Obviously, it's not going to be an automatic because you can't buy an automatic firearm in the United States. But a 9mm Beretta that looks just like Robocop's gun.
You know, it's funny because I'm now thinking you mentioned this, but I'm thinking about. Did you ever see Red Heat with Schwarzenegger? And,
yeah. I mean,
Belushi?
25 years.
There's this whole thing. Right? Okay, Belushi's got the 44 Magnum, the quote-unquote most powerful handgun in the world, and Schwarzenegger playing the Soviet officer, right, in Chicago. Actually, not. It's this. And he's got the big... There's got to be something going on here about... I have a joke later on.
You're not implying that gun size has anything to do with male psychology, I hope, Jason. Certainly there's nothing to go... No avenue of exploration in
No, there's absolutely no reason, Drew. The reason... The big bad machine is called the ED, right? He's got the big guns.
I just realized that. The ED-209.
The ED-209 is really what it's telling us.
Look, I'm not a historian of public health here, but I don't think ED meant that in 1987. I'd be curious if anyone actually knew that that's what ED meant in 1987.
I mean, they did everything but paint the damn thing blue, Drew. So...
oh, man.
All right. I want to get into this. Last time you were on here, we talked about Dirty Harry and had this amazing conversation about what policing meant, why Harry was seen as unnecessary, and all those kind of things. I kind of wonder, is Robocop is he the embodiment of a super cop? Like, is he the Dirty Harry for next generation? What's going on with the ways in which American audiences are envisioning what a police officer should be a justice deliverer? What's going on here with the embodiment of Robocop as the ultimate cop?
Yeah, I think Robocop is intended to be the anti-Dirty Harry, right? This is a critique of Dirty Harry. Dirty Harry or Harry Callahan, right? The character is sort of, he's robotic in his lack of empathy for people who commit crimes. He's so eager to pull the trigger, right? That's that first scene where he's just firing away with this, again, the most powerful handgun ever made. He's just firing away at some crowd in the streets of San Francisco trying to hit these bank robbers. He's just so quick to pull the trigger. I think the writers here saw an opportunity to satirize everything about Dirty Harry, including the character himself. And they're satirizing the fear of crime, the big guns, the violence. It's all over the top, and it never takes itself too seriously. And I think, this might be reading too much into it, but RoboCop is not a real police officer, right? Real, like actual living, breathing police departments and police officers, they don't prevent crimes. Police know this too. This is not something that they talk about all that often, but police know they don't commit crimes. They respond to crimes, right? There's this, this is why it's one of the fallacies of like, well, if we have rising crime rates, we just need more police. Well, that just means you're going to have more police who show up after the crime has been reported. Police, by and large, don't prevent crimes. They're there in the aftermath of crimes. But it's so striking, and there's almost that sort of montage there of like crimes taking place and RoboCop responding to those crimes. And like when the robber, the mugger, whatever, he's in the liquor store and he tells the woman at the cash register, put all the money in the bag or whatever, and then he pulls out the gun. And she hits the silent alarm. And like 15 seconds later, RoboCop rolls through the door. Like,
very convenient.
Absolutely impossible in any grand scheme of things, right? Like the cops are not going to show up that minute. And, people who are robbing liquor stores, they know that. The cops aren't going to be there unless there's some weird coincidence that there's a cop passing along the road. The cops are never going to be there, right? And so RoboCop is he's a fantasy, right? In that this is not something any cop could ever be. And I think that's sort of the point, right? That when we take out the human element, we're imagining some kind of world of law enforcement that could never actually manifest. I have a really important question here. Have you ever heard of Dogman?
You mean the book?
You know Dogman, the book.
I have children.
That's right, you have kids, right? Dogman.
I have an 11-year-old son who is like literally will go to Barnes & Noble. I'm like, let's buy you a book, and then he'll read the thing as we walk around. The
and he'll finish it.
Is it Dogman and Cat Kid? Is that what's the Dogman?
Oh, you're in. You're in. You know it. Yeah, Dogman and Cat Kid. That's right.
Yeah, I love
that's RoboCop. I mean, I think that is,
different RoboCop.
You need to read the first 5 pages of the first Dogman book, because you know what happened? It's terrifying. It's horrifying what happens. So there's this horrific cat, right? His name is Petey. This is Clarence. And Petey puts a bomb in a police station, and he blows up a cop and a dog. And what they do is they stitch the dog's head on the dead cop's body. I know you're looking horrified because this is horrifying, and it's the basis of a kid's graphic novel series. And I don't know, that's RoboCop, I guess.
Oh my God. Okay, so we're like, how did our parents ever let us watch this stuff? And at the same time, my kid has 57 of these books.
My son has,
Doug what's the yeah.
I mean, he had that even before he was reading it. I remember I was reading it to him, he's 3-4 years old or whatever. I'm like, this is terrifying. This yeah. So anyway, I mean, that's the Alex Murphy story. He has a sort of dog stitched on.
As one does. Okay.
That I guess is I don't know, better comparison than Dirty Harry, because I see this as a critique of Dirty Harry, and a critique of people who look at Dirty Harry and admire Dirty Harry and think that that's the way we should organize law enforcement. That's the way we should organize society. This is poking fun at these people and doing it quite effectively, I think.
I want to ask you, as we kind of move now into a little bit of your work with the most recent book. We see these very real militarized forces in RoboCop. We see them later on. We see in Die Hard, which comes out the next year, with the tanks and all the kind of stuff. Talking about, Drew, maybe this is an element we didn't talk about last time, but kind of talk about the linkages between the rise of, your book. You've got one of the great first lines, I'm telling you, of any book I can think of. America is the gun country. And you don't put you don't emphasize, it's just America is the gun country. Just, that's what it is. One of the best first lines of any book I've ever read. I'm not kidding. I love where you go with this.
Keep it simple. I can't get any more sophisticated than that. Keep it simple.
It's beautiful. I mean, it's the line delivery is great. But what are the links? Are there links, Drew, between the United States as a gun country in the 1980s and this increasingly militarized police force that we see? Is one pushing the other? What's going on here?
Oh yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, you just look at the militarization of the police in here, right? Notice the armor that the cops are wearing, right? Cops in the 80s, by and large, in real 80s America, by and large didn't look like that, right? Unless they were in SWAT units. But now all of the cops look like that. They don't dress like mail carriers anymore. They dress like they're about to go invade Baghdad. And there's a longer history here, going back to at least to 1968. And there's a big crime bill that the Lyndon Johnson administration pushes through in 1968. This is, in fact, the same bill that includes some provisions that ultimately become the Gun Control Act of 1968. There's a big omnibus crime bill. And this is where we see the creation of the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, which is a federal agency tasked with essentially distributing federal money and supplies to local and state law enforcement. Law enforcement was and mostly remains, it's a state issue. And given the nature of the federal system, we can't have anything like a national police force in the United States, as much as an agency like the FBI might try to behave like it sometimes. So in the context of the urban uprisings of the 1960s, there are rising fears of crime and crime rates. Whether or not crime was actually substantially on the rise is another question altogether. There are fears of both left-wing and right-wing extremists, what they would have called the racial extremists of the 1960s. The Johnson administration creates this agency to funnel money and supplies to local and state police agencies. And its primary function, and it's really sort of buried in this bill, and nobody really makes much of a deal about it in 1968, but its primary function over the decades will be essentially to arm police agencies with military weapons in the aftermath of American wars. So there's lots of war material left over from the Vietnam War, and a lot of it gets funneled to police agencies. Same thing with the Persian Gulf War. And then that really accelerates after 9/11 and the global war in the context of the global war on terror, when local police agencies are drafted into this imagined national battle against terrorism, right? Homeland security means not just what is the federal government doing, but what is your local police force doing? So now every police force in every small town in America has some armored personnel carrier that was deemed surplus by the U.S. military. Local and state police forces became really useful for just getting rid of that surplus. And of course, that's going to have ripple effects across the broader military industrial complex. There's never too much military production because you can always find some small town that needs a tank. It's hilarious that the small town I teach in, Ruston, Louisiana, a population of about 20,000 people, has an armored personnel carrier. Right? I don't think there's been anything like an uprising in Ruston in the 130 years of its existence. I don't know why the Ruston Police Department needs an armored personnel carrier, but that got funneled down to them through the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration that has been funneling these military weapons to local police departments for decades now. And in the film, OCP, the company, they know this. They know that by the 1980s, there's not just a military industrial complex that they can make a lot of money off of, but there's a military law enforcement industrial complex that they can make a lot of money off of. And, when you get in one, you're in on the other. So at the beginning there, right, there's the ED 209, the ED 209s, they call them, right? And their goal is to sell them to local law enforcement, which will then bring in military agencies from around the world, kind of clamoring to get their hands on one of these killer robots as well. Another thing to think about here too is that by the 1980s, the SWAT team is a fixture in police departments around the country, especially urban ones. The first is created in the late 1960s in Los Angeles. It's SWAT is special weapons and tactics. It's a team that has military style training and equipment and tactics to confront threats that appear to be better organized and armed than your average street criminal. And in some ways, Robocop arguably is a one-man SWAT team in that regard. But the thing that Robocop does that other cops are not able to do is he dispenses justice with sort of legal sanction in that regard. Because it's sort of fascinating here to think about. We live in an era of body cameras and that sort of thing, and Robocop's recording all the time, right? Everything anyone says in front of him, he gets it on video. I mean, that's the way he first he nails Jones, and then he nails the Miguel Ferrer character, and then he nails Dick Jones later. This is the way he gets them: is he's recording all the time, and he's always got the evidence on him because again, he's a program, he's not a person, as OCP describes him, and he's kind of empowered to serve as a sort of judge, jury, and executioner, like Judge Dredd, right? Another sort of science fiction character. But Judge Dredd is ultimately, he's human and he's fallible. And we're meant to believe that Robocop is this vision of a police officer that is, collects evidence without flaws and able to dispense justice within the limits of the laws and so forth. And this is why it becomes a problem later when he goes sort of AWOL, because he's no longer following the program. He's out for revenge. And that's where the film, I think, takes a turn from this like techno-capitalist dystopia to a revenge fantasy, which is more appealing to viewers, right, who really like revenge fantasies.
Isn't the revenge fantasy part a signaling part of his humanity?
Yeah.
Isn't that what people do is like get even? He goes through the home, and this is a part where the remake kind of explores more. We don't get this. Mm-hmm. This is a very short film. This movie doesn't really get in a whole lot into him I guess whenever I watched this recently, my memories of this were like, oh, he's going to rediscover who he is and he's going to come to terms with this. And they do that in this film, but it's very abbreviated. It's very abrupt. He's like, I'm Murphy now. And it's just very much so.
Well, like good science fiction, Jason, it doesn't need to explain everything to you, right? It lets you sort of make these connections on your own. And I think,
I do agree with that generally,
in the last couple of decades, films are a little more expository in that way. They want to like make sure you get the point or whatever here. And so, yeah, you do see, you see that human element there, and that's what turns him. And, we might describe it as PTSD, right? Because what's he doing is he keeps having these flashbacks to these moments of these gang members essentially, torturing him and killing him. And so that's the thing that creates that turn there, which is fundamentally human, right? A robot is not going, you're right, a robot's not going to seek out revenge. A robot is going to follow its programming, but he discovers somewhere deep down in there that he is a human. He is a real boy after all. We didn't even talk about Pinocchio. Maybe there's a Pinocchio thing here. I don't think so, but it sounded like a good connection when I...
There was like a major big budget sequel. There was a Robocop 2 with Weller, and it was Nancy Allen. Is that who?
That's Lewis. Yeah, Nancy Allen.
Lewis,
yeah.
Right?
Do you know who wrote that film?
No.
Frank Miller, the comic book artist who wrote 300,
Really?
who wrote Sin City,
Dark Knight Returns,
and The Dark Knight Returns, which I think is so applicable and such a sort of sibling text to Robocop here. I think so much of the vibe of Robocop is in The Dark Knight Returns. And also in that sense that like The Dark Knight Returns and like some of Frank Miller's later work, it's always walking this uncomfortable line of fascism, right? Like on the one hand, like, yes, we're critiquing the corporations as corrupt, but on the other hand, like the criminals are like intensely sadistic. These are not people who are the product of like structural conditions. These are people who enjoy harming and murdering other people, and they need to be kept in line as well by some middle force that can navigate between the corrupt politicians, the corrupt capitalists, and the greedy capitalists, and the sort of sadistic common people, the sadistic criminal, and that is Batman or Robocop. I don't know. Frank Miller wrote Robocop 2 and 3. I know, kind of amazing. And that was it he was like done with films after that because he said that the films didn't really like, he didn't get the kind of control over the films he wanted, and there were some problems with that.
What's amazing is Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns is easily probably the single most important comic book ever made.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I've used that in classes before to teach with
really
when I do the 1980s, because it's such a good representation of that moment with Reagan and Superman as this tool of kind of the capitalist powers, that kind of thing. So really fascinating.
I read it a lot. All right, let me ask you this. Do you have a favorite part of this film? Is there a part of this movie that really kind of that we very quickly, when we talked about this months ago, were settled on Robocop is coming having to come back. Do you have a favorite moment of this?
I do. It is when they first turn Robocop on. I mean that in like literally like power up the machine, right? So the last scene we see is Alex Murphy dying, right? And that's where it turns first person, right? So he's tortured by these sadistic criminals, and Lewis discovers him basically lying there dying. And the next thing we see is Alex Murphy being wheeled he's being wheeled on a gurney. They're bringing him into surgery, and we see that first person view of the surgery there, which I think is a great shot too, because like the doctors are so kind of professional and mechanical about it. There's nothing kind of dramatic about the way they're talking about. Why is that?
They're actual doctors.
Oh, I didn't know that. Really?
They had real doctors. They didn't even script them. They were like, just do your thing.
That's perfect. Because, I mean, that's exactly what it sounds like, right? It's like a professional, like not just zoning, put the stress and the tension out of your mind. And it's like, you do your job. And they do such a great job of it. And, he dies anyway, right? And they say that call it and whatever the time is. And the next thing we see is his like visor powering up. And I love this scene because it is, again, prescient, right? Like this is before we get any kind of real first person video games. But this is a video game perspective. So much so that video games that follow, in some ways, they replicate this scene. I'm thinking of the game. I don't know if you ever played Halo. So Halo is a classic Xbox game from, the first one was maybe 25 years ago, 2000,
Theme
2001.
songs in my head now. I was selling cars in West Palm Beach.
Right.
I would get up. I would play for half an hour before I had to go in.
That's right.
Sell.
So you're of the Halo generation, right? I mean, that was that generation.
Oh my gosh! I was playing a video game today called Skull and Bones. It just came out.
Yeah.
Right? I'm like, this has to be. I was literally thinking earlier today, this has to be hooked like I was hooked on Halo when it first came out. It's so funny you bring that up. But go on. I'm sorry.
Well, that's perfect. I mean, the opening scene of Halo is the same thing that Murphy goes through with the calibration, right? And it's all from that first person perspective. Like you're looking through his eyes, which is the same way that you look through a video game like Halo, is from that first person perspective. Robocop has what we call in the video game world a HUD, right? An HUD, a heads up display, right? Yeah. To show him like, his statistics and everything else that's going on with him. And then one of the doctors, she does that calibration with the pen, right? She's like, focus on this. Same scene in Halo.
Wow,
at the very beginning of Halo, where one of the technicians comes up, he's like, look up here, focus on this, focus down there, which is teaching you, the player, the mechanics of the game in the same way that Robocop is learning how to exist in this world. And so I love that scene, the transition from the hospital scene to him being powered up, and then his power kind of randomly flashing on at different moments. Like there's one moment it flashes on where one of the doctors is like fiddling with something and goes, shit. And like he messed something up, and then he powers down again. And then he powers up in the New Year's Eve party too, which is pretty funny. Everybody's just getting drunk and so forth. And you see that from his perspective. And I think that scene is maybe the most kind of brilliant in the film, and the way it portends our interaction with media to come in the future.
Can we talk about Peter Weller's second career?
Oh yeah. He's one of us, man.
He's one of us. Like, do we not find that going back, like after we see, like all of a sudden Peter Weller starts showing up on History Channel talking about Greco-Roman architecture?
I haven't even seen that. I was kind of curious if anyone's like bumped into him at the AHA or something like that. I mean,
no.
So he's like Renaissance studies, right? So I mean, essentially he's a historian, but he does some kind of like literature, culture, art history.
Okay. Like PhD in art history from Syracuse, if I'm correct.
No, UCLA. It's from UCLA. He did get another degree from Syracuse, but the PhD was from UCLA. Yeah, and not all that long ago, like maybe 10 years ago. I mean, this is very much.
That's
what
I think is so freaking cool. Like this guy's like, hey, I like this. I'm just gonna go do this now.
Yeah. I mean, to be completely honest, if I were in that same sort of, I mean, I think, if I were like an established actor, I'd done well, I had a good career, I had a nest egg or whatever, you go get a PhD. I mean, that's, because what we do, I think that's, we have the examined life, right? We live the examined life. And I think somebody like that clearly he's the kind of guy who can appreciate that.
Well, I don't know about you, Drew, but like for me, the reason why I became a historian was because I like telling stories. And that's what actors are. Actors are storytellers, for sure, are they not? For sure. I was talking the other day, and I was talking to a guy who's like, look, hunters and fishermen are storytellers too. It's like, we're all just storytellers. And I don't know, there's this thing that I find myself, when I would see Weller show up in a Star Trek film as the villainous admiral, kind of rooting for him anyway, because he's like, it's one of us. He's one of our guy. All right. I want to do a contingency thing for you. I usually prep the guests. This is a question I popped up as we're talking tonight. I want to do a contingency thing. We talked so much about Detroit. You're in Ruston, Louisiana.
I'm in Shreveport right now, which is about the Detroit of Louisiana. I'm probably going to get in trouble for that one, but yeah.
What happens when we set this film in Lafayette? Can we have a Cajun RoboCop?
Look, you've got buried deep down in there somewhere. You've got the accent, right? I can't do it. I can do a lot of accents, but that Cajun one, that's hard for me, man. I got Cajun friends, and I hear them say it, and it's like a mix of like French and Irish and Brooklyn. I just can never really sort of nail it down.
There would have to be a transfer. You and I have talked about this. There would be a real transformation of Jason Herbert into Jason Hebert, and that's the
RoboCop film right there. That's the RoboCop film.
Oh my gosh! So it was so weird because I stopped off at Pascal's in the Atlanta airport, which is a great Southern food, like comfort food, soul food kind of place. And the lady looks at my name. She goes, "Wait, is this Herbert or Hebert?" And I'm like,
"Leave me alone."
I'm like Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. I'm like, what do you want it to be? So yeah, it's fine. All right. I usually ask now, as we're kind of coming towards the end, what you're reading. But I've got a better question for you, Drew. You teach all these amazing classes. I hear you talk about your students and all these things. What are your students reading? What do you have them? What do you have them reading right now?
That's a tough question. So, I teach 600 classes every semester, quarter.
Yeah.
So they're reading lots of
students are responding to.
What the thing I have them read in the survey classes is the 1619 Project.
Okay,
sure. It's not. I don't have them read it, and I'm very transparent about why we're doing this from the very outset of the class. I don't have them read it because I think it's the correct way to understand American history, but because it is a contentious way of understanding American history. And by contentious, I mean it's something that we're arguing about today, right? So I think reading the 1619 Project, and crucially, which we also do during the course of the quarter, we read the commentaries on, the critiques of, the responses to the 1619 Project, shows them that history is very much alive. And that, so writing about the history of the 18th or 19th century is very much engaging in a kind of public dialogue today. And so I think that's if they take that away from my survey class, I don't care if they remember what happened in the War of 1812. I really don't. But I do want them to think about history as a conversation between the past and the present that is constantly being updated when we're talking about things like the 1619 Project.
What about for some of your upper division classes? What do students like? Something? What do you find that they're really wrestling with or liking a lot or things like that? What are your students getting into?
Man, that's a good question. I think the most effective book I've used in the upper level classes in the last few years, because I'm a historian of U.S. foreign relations, foreign policy, that's my original training, and so I teach classes and that sort of stuff. I think the best book for that purpose in the last few years is Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire, which is just a brilliant book in both, like, in the way it takes a subject that is kind of vaguely familiar to most Americans and presents them with the traditional interpretation, but then just a transformative interpretation for rethinking this thing, and does it in such a way that, talk about a storyteller. He's just a brilliant storyteller. And that book is such a model for how to write a book if you want to communicate to a broader public. I aspire to write something like that. And I, even as I was working through the second book, I was thinking, how do I do something like that? And then I realized, I'm just not that smart. I'm not going to be able to do that. So
stop it. Yeah. You were talking the other day. You literally made me roll my eyes at you the other day. I have to tell you, because you're like, oh, I don't know if I've like imposter syndrome. I'm like, fucking asshole. Like, you're one of the most talented scholars I know. And I'm like,
no way.
Christ, how am I ever gonna
I don't know who you're talking about here. I don't know.
Did you ever see Immerwahr's talk on bat poop?
The guano stuff. Yeah.
So cool. I love it.
He's a real smart guy. Yeah.
All right, let's bring this back. Robocop. Drew McKevitt, you're on the clock here. Is Robocop a history movie?
Well, I would say the same thing that I said about Dirty Harry, right? It's sort of a cop-out here, but pun intended.
Cop-out.
But it's a historical artifact, right? It's not a film that is telling us about that is trying to represent the past, but instead it's a primary source that comes to us from a particular moment. And increasingly, I think feels relevant in the last 6 or 7 years in ways it might not have, 10 or 15 years ago, not because the issues it raises weren't there, but because they weren't on the surface. But, the relationship between people and policing and how we deal with criminality, how we understand criminality, the role of big capital and corporations in these things, they're much more a part of our contemporary discourse than I think they were 10 or 15 years ago. And so it is a primary source that I think tells us a lot about who we are in the present and where we came from.
Awesome. Drew, where can people find you if they want to learn more about you, your 2 books? Are you working on a 3rd book yet? What's going on? Are you taking a break? Are you on the tour?
I don't know, man. I'm working on like number 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. No, I'm just, I don't know, taking it easy for right now. It's a lot of teaching plus a lot of writing. I'm just I got ideas for the future. I'm not sure where I'm going to go next, but you can always find me inevitably, unfortunately, still on Twitter. I can't give it up. I don't know what's wrong with me. It's a self-flagellation thing at this point, but I'm still there. I'm at Drew McKevitt, my last name, and you could always find me there.
I love it, man. Thank you so much for being here, Drew. I was so excited. I'm so glad we could finally put this together. We only have 3 more to go.
That's right. I'm ready. You just line them up, whatever Dolph Lundgren or other shit movies you want me to watch from the 80s.
We are saving I Come in Peace for the last one, but next one we got Black Rain.
That's
all right, Drew.
That's right. All right, Jason. Thanks so much.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of Movies podcast. Thank you guys so very much for being here. Thank you, of course, to our guest, Drew McKevitt, one of my absolute favorite people to be on this pod. He's just awesome. I just love this dude. And thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for putting this together and producing this for you guys. And most of all, thank you to you guys for continuing to share HATM, share what we're doing here, listening in each and every week, providing the support to tell us to keep going on this, keep growing this thing, keep talking about these things. So I hope you really enjoyed this episode. It's one of my favorites that we've recorded. I hope you dug it. And we've got more coming for you. I'm recording another one tomorrow as we're talking, and we've got a whole bunch for next week. So keep listening, and I'll see you a little bit later. Ciao for now. Bye.